Welcome to MVC, MVP, and MVVM, a comparison of architectural patterns. Oof. Sounds impressive, huh? Well, this session is an investigation of how the different software architecture patterns relate specifically to the different Microsoft developer technologies. So basically, we're going to be using a what to use where discussion, and I'm going to start out with a ASP.NET web form app, very simple one that has a little connection into a data model, and then we're going to move that into ASP.MVC. We're going to move it into an MVP pattern, maybe more akin for SharePoint. And finally, we're going to move that same exact application into an MVVM pattern using Silverlight. So we aren't going to have an exhaustive architectural discussion with a whole bunch of mental pontifications. Do you ever get into any of these sessions where they're talking about view models and MVC and MVP and so forth? And you know, it seems like the speaker is getting a real high out of it, but you aren't getting a whole lot out of it. That's not going to be one of those sessions. Actually, I don't call it mental pontification. I call it mental masturbation. But let's move on here. Ooh, I didn't say that, did I? So we'll do the what, why, how of model view controller, C, presenter, or view model, VM. We'll take that ASP.NET MVC3 example. We'll look at a web forms, talk about, hey, SharePoint's based upon ASP.NET web forms. So that kind of fits into an MVP model if you're developing in the SharePoint arena. And finally, we'll finish off with that Silverlight example. So really looking at these patterns for what they give you and not necessarily going into the whole, you know, does this fit this pattern correctly? And pattern is just that. Something to pattern after, but the idea behind the pattern and what fits into what developer technologies the best. So before I even go on here, oops, I don't want to do that. Let me switch over to my laptop and I'll set up the original demo that we'll be looking at. So I have in here an ASP.NET web form, standard client-server type of a scenario. I'll run it real quick. Didn't select the form to start with. And basically this app, let's magnify a little. Basically this app takes in a name, a speaker name, and a rating value. And it analyzes the rating value through some business logic and returns how you are doing on a gradient scale. So let's say if I put in a 4. Not too good of a rating value, right? Move it up a little. I'm not quite sure what that was. Okay, and then finally, yeah, we're doing good. So simple little app. And if we take a look, we have a model in the background here. And basically, all we're doing is putting a public string and public int for the speaker name and rating value. We're then having a view of the model, a rating class here that instantiates it, has a constructor that gives us some default values, has an update rating, really doesn't do a whole lot because we just have those values sitting there in a static object. And here's what gives the rating status. So it's going to return a 1, a -1, or a 0. Simple if-else statement based upon what that rating value is. Up in the rating form, we have code behind logic. So get a reference to that rating object, fill the original text boxes, and then on the button click, Call that update method. So we're sending it, think of it going back to some back-end database. And then we're getting our rating back by changing that individual label color. So very simple app, very few lines of code. Like I said, we're going to now convert these into these different models as we go through the session. So let's do a couple more PowerPoint slides and we'll get right back into the demos. So what is this whole model view CVMP? Once again, patterns. So it's not an exact science, it's giving you general ideas on how to implement your software. And it includes standard modules. Modules like the model, which is the data, business logic in there. You have the view, which is the presentation layer. And finally, that C or VM or P, which is kind of the glue logic that pulls the view and the model together. It's based on a separation of duties. And as we're talking about this and going through this for the next hour, keep that in the back of your mind. Separation of duties. You see it inside of internal controls, inside of systems. You see it inside of the solutions framework and separation of the different team members and so forth. This is actual software module separation. And really, how is this different from N-tier back in the 90s? Anybody remember DNA out there? I remember speaking on it in tech ed back in the 90s. I'm dating myself now. But that really gave you a tier type of a approach, separating out, but not really a pattern on how best to do it. So what we're going to do is take that a little bit further and start looking at the different patterns. All have similar goals. They basically just have a different tool set in ways to achieve them. The goals: modularity, flexibility, testability, maintainability. And this is all achieved through that separation of duties. I call it separation of duties. You'll see a lot of separation of concerns in the documentation out there. But this is the whole idea. Once you get this separation of duties, this separation of concerns, then becomes testable, a huge part of it. It's a lot easier to maintain. You can make changes on the fly a lot easier. And of course, it is modular. So let's take a look at this first one, and we'll take a look at it in the context of ASP.NET MVC 3. Model View Controller. First described 1979. Small talk at Xerox PARC. Amazing how much stuff those guys came out with. However, they never really got a whole lot of money out of it. So the controller is the centerpiece in this one. Decouples the model and view. So you have something like a user interaction event coming in. The controller grabs the event, converts it to a user action that the model can understand. The model, that's the behavior of the data, the business logic and the data for the application domain. The view interacts with the controller and directly with the model to generate a user interface. So if we go and take a look at our schematics, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, and this line should be going this way and so forth. But if we look at our standard client server, and basically it was that ASP.NET app that I was showing you, it had the client, it had the business objects built right into the client, no real separation there. Well, separation in that there was code behind. And it's going back to the server with their business objects and data. Basically what happens here is this client then gets split out into this type of a model. And notice the central theme, the controller. It's the one that connects both the view and the model. And if you look at ASP.NET MVC, it's really a kind of a variation of this known as Model 2, where pretty much everything's supposed to go through the controller. However, you still can bind directly into the model. There's also something known as an observer pattern. Maybe you need to have a scenario where there is like stock quotes coming in, and they need to be updated into the view immediately. Then you might have some indirect connections going back and forth, communicating those individual changes directly into the view back into the controller. But just use that, kind of throw it in the back of your mind, come back to it, look at it later. Let's now look at how you would actually take that individual ASP.NET application and turn it into an MVC3 application. So I'll hop on out here. No, I will not. I will switch monitors. And we'll go back over here. So we have our ASP.NET Web Form Client Server application. I'm going to go in here and add a new project in here. And we're going to make it an ASP.NET MVC3 application. We'll call it something like MVC TechEd. Press OK. Immediately it comes up. Different types of templates that you want to do. So really this is creating the infrastructure, the piping, the eventing required to implement this MVC type of model. And something new that we see here, the Razor engine, HTML5 semantic markup. And oh, hey, one of the things that MVC gives you is this testability, all right? So why don't we just create a test project along with creating that individual MVC application? So I'll do that. I'll take the default, press OK, and it's going to go out there and build this individual template. Actually, a couple of projects. One is the individual web project, and the other one is the testing project. And you see that there's an awful lot of plumbing. I selected the intranet one because there's actually a lot less code related to membership services inside of that. So we'll switch over here, set that up as my startup project. Let's make sure we're good so far. I'm going to just press enter, and away we go. Using the built-in web server. Okay. So it gives you this, just like an ASP.NET basic web application, gives you this individual plumbing related to an MVC application. And notice as we go about, it has built-in routing available to you. So, okay, many of you have probably worked with MVC already. Nothing new there. But let's go and take this application and turn it into an MVC application. So what I'm going to do now is simply go and take my rating model, and notice you've broken out into different folders here. I'm going to take my rating model and drop it into models. I'm now going to go into my views, and I'll use the index view here, which comes up by default, or not the view, I'm sorry, the controller, the home controller. And I will create a reference into that model. So we took a look at the model earlier. If anybody wants, wave your hand, we'll take another look. But it's basically in the joe.models namespace. We'll now create a static reference to it. And call it, whoops, a reference into the individual rating. Call it underscore rating. So I've now got those individual references into the individual project. Before I start and call the views, you can notice you simply have an action result that ties to the individual view, and it returns that view. Before I do that and actually return a view, let's create a view based upon the model. So let me build this, make sure everything knows about everything else. And I'll go into my home views here. I'll right-click and add a view. And we'll call it the update rating view. And we'll create a strongly typed model view. And we'll base it upon that rating model. So let's press add here. Out it goes. And why didn't I get my individual? Oh. Let's go and add. Somebody should have warned me about that. Update rating. And our template will be edit. So we'll use our rating model, and this will build a template for us to work upon. Let's add that in, and there it is. So it does this razor syntax. We have the editor field. We have the editor label. Oh yeah, it's that editor label that we wanted to manipulate, right? So let's go on in here and just wrap it inside of a span. And it's going to be a span style equals background color let's use our razor syntax. So with MVC3, we now have this new view bag. So unlike the ASP.NET forms, which try to emulate a client-server type of an approach, this is completely stateless, and you have to pass the state in between each. I'm going to put that in there, and we'll end the span down below. Thank you. How's that? Okay, so let me save that out. And let's go back into our home controller, and let's call it. So we're going to do a public action result. And this time we're going to pass it in the view. And that was update rating. And we're going to pass it the ratings reference we created earlier. That was it, right? Or rating. Should let code completion do it. So now basically what we're doing is taking that model, addressing it from the controller instead of the code behind, creating that reference just like we created in the code behind, and passing it into the individual view. So let's run this. We'll see if it works, and then do a little bit more. So we're recreating that ASP.NET web form. And to access it, we can access it directly through the routing. Oh. Sorry about that. So when I created my reference up here, I should be passing it in speaker rating, the correct object. Yay! But now we do stuff. It's not really doing anything, right? Okay, let's hook up the equivalent of that submit button inside of the form. And the way you do that inside of the MVC is to simply create another one based upon HTTP result or post. And in here, we're going to be taking in a rating model, and it's going to be passing it directly back for us. And we'll call it new rating. And let's do some code. Well, let's go and just take that code from the ASP.NET web form. Nope, that's the MVP example. And here's what we did, right? Let's put it inside of our home controller. Now we better change these two items that it's passing, right? It's not going to be passing text box 1, but it is going to be passing new rating dot speaker name, new rating dot rating value, and instead of label 2s, where are we going to stick these color values? Now remember we had that view bag, and we called it color. And we'll basically just change each one of these, change the colors. We'll go lime. And pink. So we took that code behind. And remember, the separation, segregation of duties. We're now putting this into its own complete module, not directly tied into the code behind related to an individual form and inside of the controller. So we can see as we run this, it gives us all of the wiring, all of the hookup, able to move that application into an MVC type of a pattern. So once again, we'll go to Home, Update Rating, give it a save. We're not doing too well so far. Going up. If we go back here into the individual code, we can see as we execute the code, get a little better here. And it drops. We call the update rating. Changes it. We then call the rating status. And it applies the correct color. So converting it over to MVC. And you can see inside of the individual tests, they already build out some tests, and you can test, hey, is color returning the correct thing? All we have to do is drop the individual test method in there, grab it, give some type of an assertion, and away we go, because it is completely segregated. All right, so MVC. Let's move on now to MVP. So we'll talk about that for just a second. So along comes Model View Presenter. Okay, MVC 3 is great, right? We have all of those hookups inside of it built so that we can easily build for that individual pattern. However, what if we're doing an ASP.NET Web Form application? In comes the Model View Presenter type of a pattern. Something that originated early in the 1990s, derivative of MVC. Really two types of implementation: passive view, a supervising controller type of implementation. In here, the presenter now becomes that MVC controller. The view, that's responsible for handling the UI events. The model, strictly a domain model, so no interaction directly between the view and the model. So more of a user interface-centric type of a scenario. So notice here, we have the presenter being broken out from the controller. We have an indirect relationship from the model, and we go back and forth between the view. Notice no direct type of binding into the model at all. And notice here, you get to this type of a scenario through an interface. And we use dependency injection to be able to create this type of a scenario. Once again, we're doing this separation of duties, separation of concerns. So we're separating out that logic that was in the code behind into what we now call this presenter. And if you're working in the SharePoint world, SharePoint is built upon ASP.NET Web Forms, and this fits nicely into simply modifying an ASP.NET Web Form type of an application. You also have this controller pattern where you have the direct type of a connection between the view. Once again, if you're going to be doing some type of a real-time scenario. This is right out of the SharePoint 2010 developer guidance from Patterns and Practice. So you can see that they give an example of a sandbox UI with a presenter connecting through the view and the individual model through an interface. So suggest taking a look at that. If you're doing SharePoint types of implementation, excellent way to get to this separation of duties and get this type of testing scenario implemented. So let's switch over, and we'll now look at MVP using ASP.NET Web Forms. So I've already got the code here. Don't worry, I won't be typing all that in again. And I'll set it as the startup project. So we have an ASP.NET Web Forms MVP implementation. Let's close all of these items. We'll run it once, make sure it works. Out it goes. And we have our speaker name. I didn't fill it in with a constructor. And let's go with a 4 to start with. Move it up. And working in the same exact pattern as we saw before. Let's take a look at the code that's part of this. So first of all, if we go into the rating form and look at the code behind, notice it's getting a reference into the presenter class and executing in the actual page load .add this individual class into the presenter. So it's passing this as an object. You might also notice that it is inheriting an interface or implementing an interface called rating view. So basically, the code behind this is the implementation of the rating view interface. Here, we'll pull that up. And basically it says set speaker name, set rating value, set color. If we go over here, you're seeing that it's implementing set speaker name, set rating value, set color. And then in the button one click, it simply passes to the presenter .rating update. So let's go back into the presenter here. So I go into the rating presenter. And we are creating an individual rating view. So the implementation class. And here is the add function that we saw called by the ASP.NET Web Form. And basically what it's doing is referencing itself, right? This is how you get the dependency injection so that as you execute the individual items inside here, they're going to pass through right up to the individual view itself. So notice that we have the rating update. We do a iObject rating view, set rating value, set speaker name, and then we execute a change color, which calls the interface .set color. But it's going to pass it through because of that dependency injection. So let's go over here. We'll do a rating form and create a new vertical tab group. And the rating presenter here. And let's put a breakpoint there. And we'll run this. Or actually, let's put it down. Yeah, that's good. That'll work. And we'll put them side by side. So this time we'll run it with debug, come up a little bit slower than the last time. Give us a little bit more room here now. So notice it drops in, and up we come into the rating form. Let's put in a rating value. Oops, didn't set it at the right place. Let's put it in the page load. Okay, so we drop into the presenter, .add this. Drops right in there. Here's our dependency injection. Out we go into the form. Let's add in a rating value. Notice it does it again, dropping into the individual page load. Creating it, except now we press that button, so we're going to drop into the button one click. Out it comes into .update rating. Going back into the model itself. And now we're going to be calling that interface .set rating value. Notice it drops right into the code behind for the ASP.NET web form. Sets that text value. So you can see here with this injection, we're actually separating out all the code. We can reuse that code, maintain it, create a modular type of a scenario, and still use ASP.NET web forms. And finally into the change color. Drops right through, sets the individual color. And we're back into the form. So you can get this segregation, this separation of duties, this separation of concerns by creating this type of a presenter model. Okay, let's move on to the final one, MVVM. Then we'll go back over to PowerPoint. So model, view, model. Largely based on MVC. It's actually a specialization of the MVP pattern known as the presentation model. So a little background here. However, it was built specifically for WPF and Silverlight environments. Model and view, just like MVC. However, this view model is a separation from the individual model by becoming a model of the view. So it extends the model with behaviors the view could use. So we're going to actually take that rating class and extend it with behaviors the views could use. It'll data bind between the view and model, and it passes commands between the view and model. So here we see comparing it to an MVP passive type of a scenario. We're getting the direct connects between the view and model, and then an indirect connection through a binding and eventing model built in to WPF Silverlight. So let's take a look at MVVM. Once again, I didn't need to do that. All right, so we'll close these out. And notice our structure for the MVVM sample. Here we have a main page.xaml, rating model, rating view, and view model. Let's run it real quick, see how it works, make sure it works. Got to change the startup project. Out it goes. Change the speaker rating. Oh, I didn't press submit, did I? One of the cool things is you have two-way data binding here. Fits nicely into that capability. Maybe getting better. And of course, as you'll go back, it also submits through a commanding interface. Okay, so let's take that exact same example that we've used already, and now we're going to be going into MVVM Joe. So first of all, let's open up the main page XAML. And you'll notice up here, we're referencing our individual namespace, MVVM Joe. And we're creating a reference to the rating view. We're creating a static resource binding here. And then in each one of these, notice here's our text box. We're doing a binding path, and we're setting it to a two-way binding. So let's take it a little further now. So we go into our rating model, and not a whole lot, same old thing, right? If we go into our rating view, which is where we got the reference to the binding, correct? We are creating a rating view model, the object P, with a get and set related to it. And then in the constructor, creating a new rating view model, and we're passing it some parameters. Notice we have a command, I command, and here is our update rating, taking in the rating view model as a reference. So I'll go into our rating view model now. And very importantly, notice, I notify property changed. So we're defining this, and we're implementing the iNotify property changed. We grab a reference to that rating model that we've seen several times already. We now explicitly, remember that statement? View model becomes a separated view of the model. We're actually implementing in here the individual properties. So instead of our shortcut, we're doing a full capability so we can manipulate the set of the properties. So every time we set the property, notice it triggers. Property changed event. So it's passing it back. Also, we're incorporating color as a property here and calling the individual trigger off of color. So let's look at these a couple next to each other. So we'll split this out as a vertical tab group. Put a breakpoint there. And run it. Dropped right into the rating view model. Step into it. Here's our rating view model. A little different from our other rating models. We've separated this out from the actual rating model itself and added another constructor. So we're going through this instead of the rating class itself. And we're setting speaker name, rating value, and color. Now we're dropping right into the XAML itself, the XAML code behind to initialize the component and set the individual page. Well, the page has those bindings. So the bindings are calling out to the rating view model, speaker name, rating value, and color. We also have the commanding tied into the individual submit command. So let's go up here. Get a yellow back. And we'll press submit. We drop into the individual rating view. Hey, we changed the individual color, right? It's setting that property changed. And I'm setting the color every time that individual property changes. And back we come. So you can see that there's even a more separation or a better separation with the view model here, and also the capability of tying into the two-way binding that is available inside of Silverlight and WPF. So in closing, what to use where? If you're a pure, disconnected, web-based type of an application, ASP.NET MVC3. If you have something that has UI state logic already wired up, something like ASP.NET Web Forms, something like Windows Forms, then you're really going to be fitting into a model view presenter pattern where you do the dependency injection to get the separation between the code behind and the UI wired up state. If you're using SharePoint, SharePoint is an ASP.NET Web Forms app. So if you're going to be applying an individual pattern, patterns and practices suggest that you implement it in this MVP standard type of a fashion using the techniques that I just showed you. If you're using Silverlight, WPF, you have this cool two-way data binding in here. You have the iNotifications, you have the notifications, you have the iCommanding interfaces available to you. The way you should be going is the model view, view model pattern, very much in the fashion that I just demonstrated for you. Now, I did it with a very simple, small, little application. However, you can, of course, extend this out and build from there. It now becomes testable, becomes maintainable, flexible, and all based upon this separation of duties. Okay, so that's going to finish up the individual presentation. I'd like to invite you to ask any types of questions. You still have like 15 minutes to go. Wanted to finish up with that much time. Any questions? And if you would, they're taping this, so if you just speak into the mic. Yeah, they're scrambling in the background. Are you ready for questions? Yeah, give it to me. I'll repeat it. Right. Yeah, in the supervising, the question was, when would you use a supervising controller in the MVP pattern? And that is when you need to have a direct access to data inside of the view. The stock ticker, stock trading type of a scenario is the perfect example. And it kind of fits into that whole type, you know, even a supervising controller inside of the MVC pattern. So where you need that direct connect and eventing between the individual view and model and not go through the presenter. So let's say if you're getting stock quotes and stock prices are coming in and it's basically just updating based upon those new stock prices coming in, that would be an example of where you would implement that. Any other questions? Yep. I don't think it's working. Oh, great.
MVP in Windows Forms represents a lot of development work just for creating the architecture. Is there any tools you're aware of to kind of speed that along? Anything already exists?
Well, in Windows Forms and in ASP.NET, you could take this same example here and really just drop the rating model presenter and rating view and then just wire up the logic in the code behind just like you did with an ASP.NET form. So as a matter of fact, I should have extended this sample a little bit more and thrown in a Windows form. Anything built in? No. Sorry. Not that I know of. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
It hates me. Okay, so the example with the MVP pattern where you're handling the events and then you're delegating the actions to the presenter itself.
Yes.
I've seen some examples where the events are actually delegated to the presenter itself as well, like they're wired on the presenter side.
So passed on through.
Yeah, passed on through. Would you recommend that approach, or would you say maybe stay away from it?
Well, it's all done right through the individual interface. So, you know, it's really going to be your choice of how you implement the individual pattern. All right. Anything else? Oh, yep.
So if you've already developed an application for WPF and Silverlight using the MVVM pattern,
Yes.
any suggestions if you're now going to ASP.NET MVC, how to reuse the view model?
Yeah, no data binding, so no.
That's what I thought.
Sorry. It's, I mean, you know, and the patterns are almost tied to the individual tool sets. Okay, anything else? All right, thanks. Have a good tech ed.